Before they were divided by duty, they were united by art. Welcome to the heart-wrenching world of the painter and the Duke's daughter. Imagine a society where one kiss can ruin two lives, one born of privilege, the other of passion. When Lady Clara Whitmore, bound by duty to a cold viscount, sits for the penniless artist Elias Gray, she expects only a portrait, but his gaze captures not her beauty, but her hidden sorrow, igniting a forbidden flame that threatens to burn down the rigid structure of her world. Will she choose the gilded cage her title demands, or the fire of a love born from truth? This is a story of fierce yearning, devastating choices, and the courage required to defy everything for the one thing that truly matters. Subscribe now and prepare to lose your breath in a romance born from fire and truth. The Commission. The year was not yet done with its pale, lingering chill, but already the air at Whitmore Hall hummed with the feverish anticipation of a grand spring wedding. To secure her father's legacy and her own position in the highest echelons of society, Lady Clara Whitmore, the Duke's only daughter, was to be united with Viscount Edmund Cavendish, a match celebrated in every drawing room from London to the surrounding counties. It was a union of power, wealth, and impeccable lineage, and thus a subject of infinite satisfaction to the Duke of Whitmore. The Duke, a man who viewed emotion as an unnecessary luxury and duty as the only true currency, had decreed that a portrait must be commissioned. It was not merely a record of her beauty, but an artifact of the moment, a symbol of the family's triumph. The choice of artist was not left to the whim of a local artisan. The commission was secured through Mrs. Harrow, a well-connected patroness who favored talent over pedigree, to a painter whose work was only just beginning to speak the language of genius, Elias Gray. Elias was a man born of rougher timber than the polished world he was now required to enter. At 28, he was driven by a burning, almost desperate need to translate the world's hidden truth onto canvas, a truth he felt was too often obscured by the gilded cages of the aristocracy he served. The summons to Whitmore Hall, however, was not simply a job. It was the chance of a lifetime, the single piece of gold that could buy him not only sustenance, but the respect that had been denied to him since birth. He arrived at the sprawling, cold elegance of Whitmore Hall, much as a stray cat might creep into a ballroom, keenly aware of his humble origins, yet possessing a dignity that refused to be humbled. When Clara Whitmore first encountered the man who was to capture her likeness, she was standing by a window in the immense, silent drawing room. The house staff had ushered him in, and he stood uncertainly just past the threshold, clutching a portfolio like a shield. Her initial assessment was swift and utterly dismissive. He was quiet, perhaps overly so, and possessed a severe intensity that seemed to drain the light from the already gloomy room. His coat was of good quality, certainly, but his hands, Clara noticed the hands first, were large, calloused, and stained with the enduring evidence of his trade. He smelled faintly of turpentine and oil, a scent utterly alien to the delicate perfumes of her own world. He was, in short, unpolished. The Duke, his voice a low, commanding rumble, introduced them with the brisk finality one might employ when presenting a new piece of furniture. "This is Mr. Gray, Clara. He will be completing your marriage portrait. See that you offer him every convenience, for his task is important." Clara offered a slight, practiced curtsy. "Mr. Gray, I trust you will find the light in the morning room suitable." Her voice was measured, cool, concealing the rebellious ache within her heart. She saw him not as a man, but as another instrument of her impending sacrifice, the man who would paint the beautiful gilded cage she was soon to inhabit. Elias bowed. It was not the fluid, effortless dip of a courtier, but a stiff, genuine inclination of the body. "Lady Clara," he murmured, his voice surprisingly deep, the first thing about him that suggested something beyond his humble appearance. He did not offer a compliment, nor did he make any observation about her beauty, a rarity in the men who passed through her father's drawing room. This omission, strangely, caught her attention more than any flowery phrase could have. "The first sitting will be tomorrow morning," the Duke concluded, dismissing them both with a negligent wave. "I require a portrait that speaks of grace and duty, Mr. Gray, a true representation of a duchess-to-be." Clara gave the painter a brief, non-committal look and turned to leave, but Elias's quiet response arrested her movement. "My Lord Duke," he said, his gaze fixed on Clara's retreating figure, I shall paint the truth of what I see." The Duke merely scoffed, interpreting the comment as artistic bravado. Clara, however, felt a strange internal prickle. The truth of what I see. What truth was there to see in her? A woman whose life had been meticulously arranged since the moment of her birth. The next morning, the first sitting was conducted in the airy morning room, as Clara had suggested. The room was cold, despite the fire, its atmosphere rendered sterile by the presence of a hawk-eyed chaperone, an elderly cousin of the Duke, who sat knitting by the French doors. Clara was dressed in a gown of pale blue satin, her posture impeccable, her hands folded precisely in her lap. She felt like an object, a porcelain figurine awaiting cataloging. Elias, for his part, was a man transformed by his tools. His earlier stiffness melted away as he arranged his easel and prepared his palette. He worked in silence for a long while, moving with an engrossing, purposeful economy. She watched him crush pigments, mix oils, and sharpen charcoal. The energy he contained was not aggressive, but intense, a focused, artistic fervor. Finally, he looked up. He did not ask her to smile. He did not comment on her complexion or her hair. He simply held her gaze. In the world Clara inhabited, she was accustomed to being looked at. Men looked at her with admiration, with avarice, with simple lust. Her fiancé, Lord Cavendish, looked at her with ownership, with a cold, possessive satisfaction that made her skin crawl. But Elias Gray's gaze was different. It was unseeing of her title, yet seeing of her. He was observing the set of her jaw, the faint, nearly imperceptible tremor in her hands, the distant, almost melancholic quality in her wide gray eyes. He was not looking at the Duke's daughter, the Viscountess-to-be. He was looking past the polished surface to the Clara underneath. It was a scientific, artistic investigation, devoid of any base desire, yet it made her far more unnerved than any crude compliment ever could. "The light catches the silver in your hair," he murmured, speaking for the first time in 10 minutes, his eyes never leaving hers as he made a swift charcoal stroke on a preliminary sketch pad. Clara felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She was not used to such blunt observations. "Is that desirable?" she asked, her voice a little too sharp. He shrugged, his attention already back to the canvas. "Truth is always desirable to a painter, Lady Clara, though perhaps not always to a duke." His remark was both insolent and profoundly truthful. She stared at the man, this commoner who dared to suggest a conflict between her family's expectation and her own self. After an hour, she requested a break, needing to escape the unnerving scrutiny. "The pose is perfect, Lady Clara," Elias said, stepping back to observe his work. "But the sadness does not belong to a bride." Clara turned on him, her breath catching in her throat. "You presume too much, Mr. Gray." He only met her accusation with a grave, steady look. "A painter must presume. It is our currency. And in your eyes, I see not the joy of anticipation, but the deep, quiet sorrow of obligation." The words struck her like a physical blow. No one, not her maid Lydia, not her old governess, and certainly not her father, had ever articulated the silent prison of her duty with such sharp, devastating clarity. It was the absolute truth laid bare by a man who had known her for less than a day. She stepped toward him, a reckless defiance stirring in her breast. "If you must paint my obligation, Mr. Gray, then you must be consistent." She looked him up and down, taking in his paint-smeared apron, the intensity in his dark eyes, the sheer distance between his life and hers. "You are an artist reliant on the very system that has made my life, and I suspect yours, a constant painful choice between survival and desire. Paint that truth, if you dare." A flicker of raw understanding passed between them, a swift electric acknowledgement of two disparate souls trapped by the same rigid social structure. He was trapped by his need for patronage, she by her need for duty. Elias bowed his head slightly. "I accept your challenge, Lady Clara. I shall be here tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until the task is complete." The portrait was a duty for both of them. For her, the final surrender to her fate. For him, a painful, necessary transaction. Yet as she watched him clean his brushes, a strange, undeniable thought settled in her heart. In his hands, perhaps this obligation would not be a surrender, but a revelation. She had agreed to sit for him daily until the wedding, but she realized with a strange, breathless anticipation that it was not merely her likeness that was about to be captured, but her very soul. Chapter 2. In the Light of Morning. The rigid formality of the initial sittings swiftly became a delicate, private ritual. The morning room, bathed in the cool, clear light streaming through the tall French windows, transformed from a grand, impersonal space into the sheltered world of the painter and his muse. The presence of the chaperone, the Duke's formidable cousin, became a mere fixture, a stony guardian whose focus remained fixed on her needles, believing that so long as no scandalous words were exchanged and appropriate distance was maintained, her duty was fulfilled. She failed entirely to grasp the insidious poetic intimacy that was unfolding between the artist and Lady Clara without a single compromising touch or syllable. Elias Gray had a singular power. He saw what others overlooked. While the world saw the Duke's daughter perfectly posed for sacrifice, Elias saw the restless intelligence in her eyes, the yearning in the fine line of her mouth, and the subtle, defeated slump of her shoulders when she believed no one was watching. He began the portrait with the Duke's desired facade, the perfect bride in blue satin, but his preliminary sketches told a far more dangerous story. He sketched her reading, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration over a forbidden volume of poetry. He sketched her in a moment of unconscious laughter after a clumsy attempt by him to adjust a fold in her skirt, the joy briefly wiping away the shadow of her duty. Once, when she had drifted into a light, momentary dream, her head resting against the high back of the chair, he drew the soft, vulnerable curve of her neck, capturing her not as a noblewoman, but as a young woman utterly, beautifully herself. These sketches were tucked away, secrets known only to him, yet they were the true record of their sessions, and through them Clara began to soften her formidable reserve. The stiff conversation of the early days, all talk of the weather and society gossip, melted into something deeper, something that felt like a quiet, intellectual companionship she had never known. Clara began to confide in him. It started small, a casual observation about the suffocating weight of London's season, a frustration with her lack of stimulating conversation. It quickly escalated to the core of her despair. She spoke of her fear of the marriage to Lord Cavendish, not because he was cruel in public, but because he was cold and indifferent in private, a man who saw her as an asset, not a companion. "He speaks of our future as though it were a ledger of estates and connections, Mr. Gray," she confessed one morning, her voice a low murmur that barely carried beyond the easel. "He never asks what I might wish for." Elias paused, his brush hovering above the canvas. "And what do you wish for, Lady Clara?" Her answer was wistful, almost reckless. "To travel, to see the Mediterranean light you describe in your landscapes, to walk without a chaperone, and to perhaps, if I were very daring, to paint." He smiled then, a brief, genuine curve of the lips that transformed his intense face. It was the first time she had seen it, and the sight was unexpectedly captivating. "Ah, a kindred spirit, then. The world of color is a heady intoxicant, Clara." He used her Christian name without thinking, a slip of the tongue that both startled and thrilled them both. He quickly corrected himself, his tone becoming formal once more, but the intimacy of the slip lingered in the air. "If you wish to paint, Lady Clara, you should. A life without color is merely monochrome duty." From that day forward, their sessions took on a covert new dimension. While the official portrait progressed, Elias began to instruct her. He would mix a small amount of oil paints on a spare palette and teach her the physics of light and shade, the miracle of pigment. "See how the blue in the sky is really 1,000 different shades from the lightest touch of gray to a near violet?" he would say, his voice low and earnest. "The eye only sees the whole, but the painter must honor the details." One afternoon, standing shoulder to shoulder, he guided her hand. She was attempting a simple still life of a pear. As he held her wrist, gently correcting the angle of her brush, their fingers touched. It was an accident, a brief electric contact, but it was enough to shatter the carefully constructed composure of the room. The air grew charged. It was not merely the heat of the fire or the intensity of the light, but the sudden sharp awareness of their physical bodies. His nearness was overwhelming. The faint scent of turpentine, the warmth radiating from his large, stained hand, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Clara felt a profound tremor run through her. This touch, so innocent yet so profound, spoke a language of connection that had nothing to do with noble lineage and everything to do with truth. She was not a duke's daughter to him. She was simply a woman whose hand he was guiding. Elias, equally affected, withdrew his hand as if burned, his gaze flickering rapidly from her flushed face to the canvas. His own breathing had become uneven. You have a natural touch, Lady Clara, he managed, his voice now rough. Only because of your guidance, Mr. Gray, she replied, her own voice breathless. The pair was forgotten. All that mattered was the proximity, the shared secret, the dizzying drop into mutual, forbidden awareness. The dangerous current developing between them did not go unnoticed forever. The official portrait neared completion, and the Duke of Whitmore requested a private viewing of the work in progress. He swept into the studio accompanied by Lord Cavendish, Clara's fiancé, their presence immediately shrinking the room and choking the atmosphere with their proprietary arrogance. The Duke studied the portrait first. The rendering of the blue gown and the pearl necklace was excellent, the likeness undeniable. Yet there was something in the eyes, a depth, an intelligence, a quiet fire that made the Duke frown. The technique is acceptable, Mr. Gray, the Duke pronounced, his tone conveying mild annoyance. But she looks melancholy, a strange expression for a bride of Cavendish. Then Lord Cavendish stepped forward. The Viscount was handsome in a cold, chiseled way, and his gaze on Clara was always the same, appraising. He looked at the portrait, then at the easel. Beneath the half-finished painting, a stack of Elias's preliminary sketches was inadvertently exposed. One drawing, the quick, vibrant sketch of Clara laughing, lay facing up. Cavendish picked it up between two gloved fingers as if handling a piece of refuse. "What is this, Mr. Gray? This does not look like my future Viscountess. She looks wild, reckless." He glanced at Clara, a cold, warning look in his eyes that only she could truly understand. The Duke took the sketch. In this quick charcoal study, Clara was not posing for duty. She was simply alive. "This is too intimate, Mr. Gray," the Duke roared, his face reddening. "It is inappropriate. Your commission is to paint my daughter as she is, a lady of society, not some rustic muse to your fanciful notions. You are here to serve a purpose, not indulge in artistic liberties." He dropped the sketch onto the floor. Elias's jaw tightened, his own artistic pride wounded, but more so his protective instinct for Clara was suddenly aroused. "My Lord Duke, an artist must capture the spirit, not just the silk. This sketch merely captures the Lady Clara's true vivacity." "I do not require vivacity," the Duke thundered. "I require appropriateness. You will ensure the final portrait adheres to the dignity of her station. The look of sorrow of obligation you spoke of has no place here. Do you understand me, sir?" The message was clear. Stay in your place. Elias's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him, replaced by the grim knowledge of his subservient position. He was penniless. The Duke was his lifeline. "I understand, my lord," Elias said quietly, picking up the discarded sketch. As the Duke and Lord Cavendish swept out, leaving the room to the heavy silence of their command, Clara stood rigid, her face pale. She looked at Elias, the raw humiliation in his eyes, and a fierce, protective anger burned in her chest. "They do not deserve your truth," she whispered. Elias simply began scraping the upper layer of the official portrait with a palette knife, already dulling the fire he had put into her eyes. He looked at her, and the distance in his gaze was immediate and painful. "The Duke has commanded a lie, Lady Clara," he said, his voice flat. "And I must paint it. It is the price of my livelihood." The chasm of their class difference, temporarily bridged by shared art and confidences, had been violently reopened. Elias had been ordered to retreat, and the light which had fostered their blossoming connection suddenly felt cold and exposing. Their artistic refuge had been invaded, and the cost of their secret intimacy had just been tallied. Chapter 3. The Distance Between Us. Following the Duke's sharp rebuke, a wall of ice descended upon the morning room. Elias Gray, stung by the public humiliation and terrifyingly aware of the livelihood he stood to lose, retreated entirely. He became a man consumed by the rigid mechanics of his craft. He arrived precisely on time, worked with a silent, focused intensity, and departed the moment the clock declared the sitting over. He pulled away with a decisive cruelty, his entire posture conveying a stark message. "I am merely the commissioned artisan, Lady Clara, and you are merely the Duke's daughter." He now painted what he was paid to paint, the facade of the perfect, dutiful bride. He softened the intelligent intensity in her eyes, straightened the rebellious curve of her mouth, and rendered the blue satin gown with an almost suffocating perfection. The truth was erased, replaced by an elegant, lifeless lie. Clara, hurt and utterly confused by the sudden, painful shift, tried to bridge the chasm. She attempted to restart their easy conversations to speak of art or even her fear, but he met every overture with a formality so stiff it was impenetrable. "That is a particularly lovely shade of crimson, Mr. Gray," she might offer, trying to sound casual. "Thank you, Lady Clara. It is a alizarin matter," he would reply without meeting her eyes, his tone clipped and professional. The air, once charged with shared curiosity, now crackled with unspoken tension and mutual frustration. Clara felt an overwhelming wave of resentment. He had seen her, truly seen her, and now he was punishing her for the very existence of that forbidden truth. 3 days passed in this agonizing silence, the distance between them growing wider than the expanse of the canvas. Finally, Clara could bear the emotional exile no longer. One afternoon, just as the chaperone had departed for her customary afternoon tea, and before Elias could pack his brushes, Clara rose from her chair, her silk skirts rustling with an agitated urgency, and confronted him. "Why, Mr. Gray?" she demanded, her voice low and trembling with contained emotion. "Why have you built this wall between us? Does my father's displeasure truly necessitate this sudden, cruel distance?" Elias was cleaning his palette with a meticulous, unnatural calm. He did not look up. "The distance is necessary, Lady Clara. The Duke was correct. I was overstepping my place. I am a hired hand, nothing more. A hired hand who claimed to seek the truth," she shot back, her breath hitching. "You spoke of painting the soul. Was that all just artistic flirtation? Did you mean none of it?" He slammed the palette knife down onto the table. The sharp clang echoed in the large room, and he finally turned, his eyes dark with a suppressed fury that rivaled her own. "Of course I meant it," he bit out, his voice dangerously low. "But unlike you, Lady Clara, I cannot afford to live in a romantic fantasy. Your world can forgive a brief, reckless flirtation with an artist. It is merely a charming anecdote to share over tea. But my world, the reality of my empty pockets and my reputation, cannot survive it. Do you imagine what would happen if the Duke discovered your confidences? I would not only be dismissed, I would be ruined, unemployable." He gestured around the vast, elegant room. "You accuse me of coldness, but you sit here, dressed in silk, playing with the dangerous feelings of a man you deem beneath you, all while preparing to marry into a title. You want the drama of freedom, but you will still accept the comforts of your cage." His accusation, brutal and laced with the pain of his own class resentment, struck her to the core. Tears welled in her eyes, not from anger, but from the devastating accuracy of his words. "You judge my privilege, then?" she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "You think I choose this cage? You think marrying a man like Cavendish, who sees me only as a strategic alliance, is a life of comfort? My entire existence is dictated by my duty, Mr. Gray. I yearn for the freedom of your easel, the liberty to choose my own poverty over this gilded servitude, but my father's entire legacy rests on this match. Do you truly believe my life is a matter of choice?" Her vulnerability was a shock to him. He had anticipated her anger, her pride, but not this raw, wounded honesty. "Clara?" The single word, her name, left his lips on a ragged breath, stripped of all titles and formality. It was a plea, a confession. Just as the emotional storm reached its breaking point, the sky outside turned a bruised purple. A fierce, sudden rainstorm burst against the windows, followed by a violent crash of thunder that rattled the ancient panes. The sudden darkness, the deafening noise, and the shocking intimacy of their confrontation combined to create a sense of being utterly alone in a tumultuous world. The room was plunged into shadow, lit only by the sporadic, brilliant flashes of lightning. Instinctively, Clara took a step toward him. Elias, his face etched with a desperate mix of desire and terror, took a step back. "We must not," he ground out, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This is madness. I think," Clara said, her voice barely audible above the deluge, "that for the first time in this dreadful house, it is truth." The tension, built up over weeks of shared glances and forbidden intimacies, the weight of their class difference, the clash of their duties, and the overwhelming fear of what they both truly wanted, snapped. A sudden, blinding flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a deafening clap of thunder. In that shared moment of shock, Elias closed the distance. He reached for her, his large, paint-stained hands cupping her face with a shocking tenderness. He didn't ask, he simply claimed. Their forbidden kiss was not gentle, but fierce, desperate, and terrifyingly honest. It was a collision of fire and water, a raw, breathtaking outpouring of weeks of suppressed longing. Clara responded with an intensity that surprised them both. She clung to him, pouring all her fear, her duty, her rebellion, and her burgeoning love into the contact. For that suspended moment, trapped by the rain and the thunder, they were not the painter and the Duke's daughter. They were simply Elias and Clara, two human beings who had found a dangerous, beautiful shelter in one another's arms. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, the candle on his work table flickered, casting their faces in a flickering, ghostly light. They stared at each other, the reality of what they had done settling over them with a crushing weight. The kiss was not a playful indiscretion. It was an act of profound, mutual betrayal of their social orders. Guilt immediately consumed them. The sweet taste of the kiss was instantly soured by the devastating knowledge of its consequences. Elias was the first to regain control, pulling away completely, his chest heaving. He rubbed a trembling hand over his face. "God help us," he muttered, turning his back to the ravaged storm outside. "I cannot stay here. I have ruined everything." Clara said nothing, simply staring at the dark smudge of oil paint now imprinted on the cuff of her pale gown from his touch. It was the mark of their sin, their secret. The next morning, the sun rose on a world returned to silence, but their world was permanently shattered. Elias looked at the unfinished portrait, the pale, dutiful bride, and then at Clara, her eyes still haunted by the kiss. He knew what he had to do. He would finish the portrait as quickly as possible, giving the Duke his lie. He would collect his meager pay. He would leave. He resolved that once the canvas was dry and the coin was in his hand, he would vanish from Whitmore Hall and from Clara's life, carrying only the devastating memory of a storm, a candle, and a single forbidden kiss. It was the only way to protect her, and the only way to salvage what remained of his own future. And so ends part 1 of The Painter and the Duke's Daughter. The storm has passed, but the air is now heavier with unspoken consequence. A single forbidden kiss has shattered the carefully constructed walls of duty and class, leaving both Clara and Elias trembling on the precipice of ruin. They chose passion over prudence, but now they must pay the price. Their love is a devastating, beautiful secret, but secrets in the great houses of England rarely stay silent for long. Join us for part 2 to witness the crushing fallout of their intimacy, the Duke's terrible vengeance, and the heartbreaking moment where love is forced to choose between sacrifice and survival.